Frostbite doesn't scream. It whispers. It numbs the mind before it takes the limbs. Out in the unforgiving Wyoming backcountry, an isolated combat veteran finally surrendered to a minus 30-degree whiteout, closing his eyes to die. Then, a massive shadow with amber eyes tore through the ice. Snow fell not in drifting flakes, but in horizontal sheets of jagged ice. It scoured the exterior of the rusted A-frame cabin, sounding like handfuls of gravel thrown against the siding. Inside, Garrett sat on the edge of a military cot, lacing his boots with stiff, uncooperative fingers. He was 35, but his joints belonged to an 80-year-old. His left knee was a master class in orthopedic titanium, and his lower back served as a constant, dull reminder of a hard landing in Kandahar 6 years prior. Garrett lived 20 miles outside of Cody, Wyoming, at the end of a logging road that the county stopped plowing in November. He preferred it that way. Silence was a commodity he bought with isolation. Down in the valley, people asked questions. They looked at his scars with pity, or worse, unearned reverence. Up here, the mountains didn't care what he had done or who he had lost. The wilderness was aggressively indifferent, and Garrett found peace in that brutal honesty. But today, the indifference was leaning toward lethal. The storm had blown in 48 hours early. The temperature plummeted to 20 below zero before noon, and the wind chill pushed it into the realm where exposed skin died in minutes. Garrett had 2 cords of wood stacked on the wraparound porch, but the primary heating exhaust pipe on the roof had frozen over. The pellet stove was chugging, struggling to vent. If he didn't clear the ice dam choking the aluminum flue, carbon monoxide would flood the tight cabin. It was a simple chore. 5 minutes on a ladder. He zipped his heavy canvas parka, pulled down his insulated face mask, and grabbed a rubber mallet from the mudroom. Stepping out the front door was like stepping out of an aircraft at altitude. The wind punched the breath from his lungs. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The world was a chaotic, swirling canvas of gray and white. Garrett kept one hand on the rough timber of the cabin's exterior wall, feeling his way toward the woodshed, where he kept the aluminum extension ladder. He found it, dragged it through the knee-deep drifts, and hooked the top rungs over the edge of the roofline. He didn't bother anchoring the feet. The snow was packed hard enough to hold it. He climbed. 3 rungs up, his bad knee flared, a sharp spike of nerve pain shooting up his thigh. He gritted his teeth and kept moving. The wind was deafening. It roared through the pines, snapping branches that vanished instantly into the whiteout. He reached the eaves, gripping the frozen edge of the roof with his heavy gloves, and swung the mallet at the thick collar of ice strangling the vent pipe. 1 strike. 2. The ice cracked. On the 3rd swing, the wind gusted, a sudden violent microburst that slammed into Garrett's side like a physical blow. The ladder shifted. Not much, just an inch, but it was enough to break the friction holding the feet in the snow. Garrett felt the sickening sensation of weightlessness. He dropped the mallet and reached for the gutter, but his thick gloves found no purchase on the frozen metal. He fell backwards. It wasn't a long drop, maybe 8 feet, but below the roofline was a steep, rocky ravine that fed into a dry creek bed. Garrett hit the packed snow on the edge of the embankment, his momentum carrying him over the lip. He tumbled down the 40-degree slope, crashing through dormant briar bushes and striking buried granite boulders. He slammed into the bottom of the ravine with bone-jarring force. His right leg caught between 2 submerged rocks, snapping with a loud, wet pop that was audible even over the howling wind. Garrett lay on his back, staring up at the swirling gray sky. For 10 seconds, there was no pain, just shock. Then, the adrenaline retreated, and the agony arrived in a blinding rush. He gasped, tearing his face mask down to pull in freezing air. His right femur was fractured, likely a spiral break. He couldn't move the leg. Whenever he tried to shift his hips, white-hot fire detonated in his thigh, making his vision swim with black spots. "Okay," he muttered to himself, his voice sounding thin and pathetic in the storm. "Okay, assess." He was at the bottom of a 20-foot ravine. The incline was steep, completely covered in slick, hard-packed snow. His cabin was up there. Warmth was up there. He tried to drag himself upward using his elbows, but the moment he pulled his body weight, the broken bone shifted. He screamed, dropping his forehead into the snow. He was wearing a heavy parka, but his pants were standard canvas work trousers, already soaked through from the tumble. The temperature was continuing to drop. Garrett was a Navy SEAL. He knew the physiological stages of freezing to death intimately. First came the shivering, violent, and uncontrollable, as the body burned its reserves trying to generate heat. Then came the apathy, the confusion. Finally, the terminal burrowing and the paradoxical undressing, when the dying brain misfired and made the victim feel burning hot. He had maybe an hour before his core temperature dropped past the point of no return. He tried again, clawing his fingers into the snow crust, dragging his torso up the incline. He managed 2 feet before his grip gave out, sending him sliding right back to the bottom. The pain in his leg made him vomit. He spat acidic bile into the snow, shivering so hard his teeth clicked together like castanets. Minutes bled away. The cold was a physical weight pressing down on his chest. He couldn't feel his toes. His fingers were stiffening into useless claws. The violent shivering began to subside, replaced by a deep, heavy exhaustion. It wasn't so bad, he realized hazily. The pain was fading. A strange, numbing warmth started to spread from the center of his chest. Garrett let his head fall back against the drift. He closed his eyes. The wind sounded like the ocean now. It was almost peaceful. 5 miles away, a massive shape moved with mechanical efficiency through the tree line. Grim did not walk. He pushed through the snowpack. He was a purebred German shepherd, bred in the Czech Republic, weighing 115 pounds of dense coiled muscle. His coat was entirely black, matted now with ice and pine sap. For 6 days he had been surviving alone in the Bitterroot Wilderness. Grim was a patrol and tracking K-9 for the county sheriff's department. A week ago, his handler, Deputy Wade, had pulled his cruiser onto a remote logging road to check a suspicious vehicle report. Wade had stepped out of the truck, clutched his chest, and collapsed in the snow. Grim had paced the back seat of the customized kennel, whining, barking, then finally throwing his massive frame against the reinforced wire mesh until the latch gave way. He had stood over Wade for 2 days, keeping coyotes at bay until the deputy's body grew cold and stiff. Driven by agonizing hunger and a deeply ingrained drive to patrol, Grim eventually wandered into the tree line. He had survived on a frozen hare he managed to dig out of a snowbank and a half-eaten deer carcass left by a mountain lion. But he was starving. His ribs showed through his thick double coat. His paw pads were cracked and bleeding, leaving tiny pink smears in the snow with every step. The wind shifted, bringing a heavy gust down the mountain. Grim stopped. His ears, large and triangular, swiveled forward like radar dishes. He lifted his broad muzzle, testing the air. Amidst the sharp scent of pine and ozone, there was something else. Copper, sweat, distress. It was the scent of a human in terminal shock. Grimm's training overrode his hunger and his exhaustion. His body remembered the drills. Find, alert, hold. He let out a low, rumbling huff, lowered his head, and began to run. He bounded through the snow, launching his heavy body forward, driven by a singular, obsessive focus. He reached the edge of the ravine, just as the heavy gray light began to fade into night. Down in the creek bed, a dark lump lay half buried in the accumulating snow. Grim slid down the embankment, his powerful back legs acting as brakes. He approached the motionless figure carefully. Garrett was deep in the final stages of hypothermia. He was drifting in a hallucination, back in a Humvee out in Helmand Province, waiting for the air conditioning to kick in. When a heavy, wet nose nudged his cheek, he barely registered it. Grim whined, a high-pitched, anxious sound. He pawed at Garrett's shoulder. Nothing. The man's face was chalk white, his lips tinted blue. Grim shoved his massive head under Garrett's neck and lifted, trying to rouse him. Garrett's eyelids fluttered open. Through a tunnel of fading vision, he saw a giant black wolf standing over him. Its amber eyes were locked onto his. So this is it, Garrett thought, too exhausted to feel fear. I'm getting eaten. But the animal didn't bite. Instead, Grim lay down directly on top of Garrett's chest. The dog sprawled his massive body out, pressing his dense, heat-radiating undercoat against the man's freezing torso. Grim draped his thick neck over Garrett's throat, shielding the veteran's carotid artery from the wind. For 20 minutes they lay there. The intense biological furnace of the shepherd began to penetrate Garrett's parka. The veteran gasped, his lungs spasming as a microscopic fraction of warmth hit his core. He reached up with a wooden hand, his fingers tangling in thick, coarse fur. Grim licked the frost off Garrett's eyelids. The human was alive, but the dog knew instinctively that body heat wouldn't be enough. The snow was piling up too fast. They would both be buried. Grim stood up, shaking the snow from his coat. He looked up the steep 20-foot incline toward the dark shape of the cabin above. Then he looked down at Garrett. The K-9 moved to the man's shoulder. He bypassed the arm, diving his snout toward the thick fabric of Garrett's canvas parka. Grim opened his jaws, revealing heavy, bone-crushing, carnassial teeth, and clamped down precisely on the heavy-duty reinforced drag handle sewn into the back of the coat's collar. Grim planted his paws. He dropped his hindquarters low to the ground, aligning his spine for maximum leverage, and he pulled. Garrett weighed 220 pounds. Grim weighed 115. It defied physics. The dog's claws tore through the packed snow, seeking the frozen earth beneath. He let out a guttural, choked growl through his clenched jaws. Inch by agonizing inch, Garrett's body moved. Grim dragged the heavy, unconscious man up the 40-degree slope. Every foot was a battle against gravity and ice. The dog's muscles corded and trembled under his black coat. His lungs burned. Two of his claws cracked under the immense strain, snapping off at the quick. Bright red spots painted the snow where his paws slipped, but he reset his grip and surged backward again. Garrett felt the movement through the haze. He felt the jarring pain in his broken leg, but it was distant. He just felt the relentless, rhythmic tugging. Halfway up the slope, Grim hit a patch of sheer ice. His paws spun out. He lost his footing, and Garrett's dead weight pulled them both down 3 feet. Grim slammed his paws down, digging frantically until he found purchase on a buried root. He held the ground. He didn't let go of the collar. The dog closed his eyes, let out a sound that was half whine, half roar, and pulled again. It took 35 minutes to clear 20 feet. When Grim finally dragged Garrett over the lip of the ravine and onto flat ground, the dog collapsed, panting violently, his chest heaving like a bellows. But he didn't rest for long. He stood over Garrett, grabbed the man's cuff in his teeth, and began to drag him the remaining 20 yards toward the dark, silent cabin. Wood groaned under the dead weight of the unconscious man. Grim hauled Garrett onto the covered porch, his cracked paw pads leaving distinct, dark smears across the frozen planks. The wind shrieked through the eaves, but the overhanging roof finally offered a reprieve from the relentless horizontal ice. Grim dropped the heavy canvas collar. He swayed, his massive chest heaving, his hind legs trembling from the sheer caloric expenditure of the drag. Garrett remained motionless. Ice crystals clung to his eyelashes and the stubble on his jaw. Grim did not rest. He paced around the veteran, whining, nudging Garrett's limp hand with his snout. He bit gently into the sleeve of the parka and tugged, a sharp, insistent jerk. Garrett's consciousness swam up from a dark, suffocating abyss. Pain returned first, a blinding, white-hot flare in his right thigh that made his breath catch in his throat. He opened his eyes. The world was blurry, tinted blue at the edges. He saw the tongue-and-groove ceiling of his porch. He saw the black silhouette of the dog standing over him. Reality crashed down. He was on the porch. He was freezing to death. His femur was snapped. "Good boy," Garrett rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves crushed underfoot. He couldn't feel his hands. He couldn't feel his feet. He rolled onto his left side, biting down on his lower lip until he tasted copper. He had to get inside. Garrett dug his left elbow into the wooden floorboards and dragged his upper body toward the front door. It was only 6 feet away, but it felt like a marathon. Every movement caused the broken ends of his femur to grind together. He didn't scream. He just let out a steady, animalistic hiss through his teeth. Grim stayed right beside him, pushing his heavy shoulder against Garrett's ribs, offering physical support and a dense wall of body heat. He reached the door. His fingers were stiff, useless chunks of frozen meat. He couldn't grip the brass knob. He clumsily hit it with the heel of his hand, trying to find enough friction to turn it. His hand kept slipping. Panic, cold and sharp, finally managed to pierce through his apathy. If he couldn't open the door, he would die on his own welcome mat. Grim watched him struggle. The dog moved forward, shoved his broad muzzle under Garrett's forearm, and wedged his snout against the base of the knob. Garrett pressed his palm flat against the brass, using the dog's head to trap his hand in place. He leaned his entire upper body weight to the right. The mechanism clicked. The heavy oak door swung inward. Garrett dragged himself over the threshold, collapsing onto the rough-hewn floorboards of the mudroom. Grim followed, pushing the door shut with his hindquarters until the latch clicked. The sudden silence was deafening. The roar of the storm was reduced to a muffled, continuous thudding against the exterior logs. Inside, the cabin was brutally cold. The pellet stove had died hours ago, choked by the ice dam Garrett had failed to clear. The indoor temperature was already dropping below freezing. "Back up," Garrett mumbled, his brain sluggish. Need the backup. 10 feet across the living room was a traditional stone hearth. Beside it sat a metal bucket of dry kindling and a stack of split oak. Garrett dragged himself across the rug. His wet trousers left a dark trail on the fibers. He reached the hearth and pulled himself up into a sitting position, his back against the cold river stones. He reached into the bucket with 2 numb palms, scooping out handfuls of cedar shavings and dropping them onto the grate. He added 3 small pieces of kindling. Next to the bucket was a long-barreled butane lighter. Garrett clamped it between his palms, pressed the ignition button with his thumb knuckle, and held the flame to the shavings. Fire flared. It was small, fragile, and desperate. Garrett fed it another piece of wood, then another. As the flames grew, they cast dancing orange shadows across the room. Grim stepped closer, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight. The giant shepherd circled twice and collapsed on the rug directly next to Garrett, resting his heavy chin on the man's uninjured left knee. Garrett stared at the fire, shivering violently as the ambient temperature slowly began to rise. The physiological thaw was agonizing. As blood slowly returned to his extremities, it felt like thousands of red-hot needles driving into his fingertips and toes. But that pain was secondary. The real threat was his right leg. He looked down. His thigh was swollen, the heavy canvas of his trousers straining against the expanding tissue. If the jagged edge of the femur severed his femoral artery, he would bleed out internally in less than 5 minutes. He had to stabilize it. "Okay, buddy," Garrett whispered, his teeth chattering. "This is going to suck." He dragged himself toward the coffee table, grabbing a roll of industrial duct tape from the bottom shelf. He grabbed an iron fire poker from the hearth stand. He placed the heavy iron rod against the outside of his right leg. He ripped a long strip of tape with his teeth. Gripping the ends, he slid it under his thigh. The slight lift caused a wave of nausea so intense the room spun. Grim whined, sitting up and pressing his chest against Garrett's shoulder. "Hold on, just hold on," Garrett muttered, wrapping the tape tightly around the iron poker in his thigh. He did it 3 more times, above the knee, below the hip, and right over the break. He pulled the last strip tight, locking the limb in place. The stabilization worked, but the shock to his nervous system was absolute. Garrett slumped backward, his head hitting the floorboards. The fire crackled. The dog let out a heavy sigh, lay down across Garrett's chest, and the veteran finally gave in to the darkness. Night in the backcountry is an absolute suffocating presence. Inside the cabin, the only light came from the dying embers in the hearth. Garrett drifted in a feverish, agonizing haze. His internal thermostat was shattered. 1 minute he was sweating profusely, trapped in the memory of a sun-baked tarmac in Kabul. The next, he was shivering so violently his teeth cracked together. Through it all, the immense grounding weight of the black shepherd remained anchored to his chest. Whenever Garrett thrashed, threatening to dislodge the improvised splint, Grim would let out a low warning growl and press his muzzle firmly against the veteran's cheek. It was a tactical, deliberate pressure. "Stay still. Stay here." Hours bled into one another. Sometime around 3 a.m., the fire burned down to ash. The bitter cold began to seep back through the floorboards. Garrett woke, his mouth dry as cotton, his leg radiating a dull, throbbing heat that felt like a localized infection. He reached up, his fingers burying into the thick, coarse fur of the dog's neck. He felt the heavy nylon collar. His fingers traced the rigid outline of a metal tag. He unhooked the brass clip and brought the heavy tag close to his face, squinting in the dim ambient light from the window. K9 Grim, Carbon County Sheriff's Department. Garrett let his hand drop. He looked at the massive black head resting on his sternum. The dog's ribs were prominent. He was starving. His paws were battered. He was a working dog, highly trained, highly driven, and entirely alone. "You lost your guy," Garrett whispered into the dark. Grim shifted, his ears twitching at the sound of a human voice, but he didn't lift his head. "I know what that feels like," Garrett said softly. The cynical armor he wore, the isolation he had built around himself, cracked open just a fraction. He had retreated to this mountain to avoid the ghosts of his own unit, only to be saved by a dog carrying the exact same kind of grief. Two broken soldiers discarded by circumstance, keeping each other alive on a frozen floor. Dawn broke not with sunlight, but with a gradual bruised-gray lightning of the windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so absolute it rang in the ears. Garrett knew nobody was coming. He was miles off the main road, and his driveway was buried under 3 feet of powder. If he didn't call for help, they would both die of dehydration and exposure. 10 feet away, sitting on an oak desk, was his VHF radio transceiver. It was hooked to a solar-charged battery bank. "Move, Grim," Garrett croaked. The dog stood, shaking himself, his joints popping in the cold air. Garrett gritted his teeth, dug his elbows into the floor, and began the agonizing crawl toward the desk. It took him 10 minutes to cross the 10 feet. He pulled himself up using the edge of the desk, his splinted leg dragging uselessly behind him. He unhooked the microphone. "Mayday, mayday. This is Civilian Station Whiskey Tango 7. Medical emergency at grid..." He rattled off his coordinates, his voice raspy but steady. Static hissed. Then, a voice broke through. "Whiskey Tango 7, this is dispatch. We read you. Medevac is grounded due to weather, but County Plow and EMS are attempting to clear the logging road. ETA is 2 hours. Hang tight." Garrett dropped the mic. He slid back down to the floor, his back against the desk. He was completely spent. Grim walked over, lay down, and placed his heavy head in Garrett's lap. 2 hours later, the distant rhythmic thumping of diesel engines broke the silence. The sound of a plow blade scraping ice. Then, the crunch of heavy boots on the porch. "Sheriff's Department! EMS!" a voice yelled. The front door kicked open. 2 paramedics and a county deputy rushed in, bringing a blast of freezing air with them. They stopped dead in their tracks. Sitting against the desk was Garrett, pale and sweat-soaked, with an improvised iron splint duct-taped to his leg. Standing over him, teeth bared, hackles raised, was a 115-pound black German shepherd. A deep, territorial rumble vibrated in Grim's chest. "Whoa, hey," the deputy said, dropping his hand to his holster. "Is that—" "Don't touch your gun," Garrett snapped, his voice suddenly hard and commanding. He rested a hand on Grim's back. "Stand down, buddy. They're friendlies. Stand down." Grim looked at Garrett. He let out a sharp exhale, the growl fading, and sat back on his haunches, though his eyes never left the paramedics. "Jesus," the deputy breathed, stepping forward. "That's Deputy Wade's dog. We've been looking for him for a week. We thought he froze." "He didn't," Garrett said, grimacing as the paramedics knelt beside him with trauma shears. "He dragged me out of a ravine. Saved my life." The paramedics worked quickly, cutting away the canvas pants, checking his vitals, preparing the stretcher. They lifted Garrett onto the backboard. The pain spiked, sending a wave of black across his vision. "All right, let's move him," the lead medic said. "Deputy, secure the animal. Animal control can pick him up." Grim barked, a sharp, deafening sound in the small cabin, and stepped between the stretcher and the door. Garrett reached out, grabbing the deputy's sleeve with a grip like a vice. No animal control. Sir, he's county property. We have to... I don't care, Garrett interrupted, his eyes locking onto the deputy's. He's not property. He's a veteran. He rides in the ambulance with me. The deputy looked at the massive dog, then at the fractured, bleeding man on the stretcher. He nodded slowly. Yeah. Okay. Come here, boy. Grim didn't go to the deputy. He walked to the side of the stretcher, pressed his wet nose against Garrett's dangling hand, and followed them out into the blinding white snow. Survival isn't just about refusing to die. Sometimes it's about the unexpected saviors who refuse to let you go. If this story of raw grit and unbreakable animal spirit moved you, drop a like and share it with someone who needs a reminder to keep fighting. Subscribe to the channel for more incredible, real-life tales of survival and loyalty. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a moment of the action.